reasserted the concerns of a business and the need to restructure, bail out business, bail out around the interests of profit and big business. That moment very much did demobilize, disorientate the climate movement. But I think that what is happening at this moment in time will not do that. In fact, I think it will give momentum to the debates that Michelle was talking about earlier on in terms of a Green New Deal, etc. In the chapter I wrote, I spoke that I said, I'll just read the quote. I was talking about the end of 2019. I said it's a key moment which opens up possibilities delivering economic and social transformation necessary to restructure away from fossil fuels, and possibilities that will only be realised if the social forces of the working class are able to mobilise behind these demands. I think across the climate movement, there's a real willingness to push those ideas of a Green New Deal, of just transformation, of a just transition, of no going back into the heart of climate campaigning going forward. I want to finish really just by talking about, for those of us on the left, as part of a working class and trade union movement, what are the challenges for us and the strategies that I think we need to employ in these circumstances. Again, I wrote that the climate strikes were important because it pulls debate into the working class, but I said it also it also exposes some of the fault lines within the unions. And I think these are things that we have to engage with in this current context. We're in a fantastic opportunity to unite a really powerful movement from below, working class people globally, alongside environmentalists and trade unionists, with this desire for a real transformation of society. But it does mean thinking about the traditions within the climate movement, within the trade union movement, that we want to amplify, to win. Because there are competing traditions within the climate movement. Michelle mentioned the longshoremen who stood alongside Indigenous people in opposing the anti-fracking movement, closed down the ports. I think that's a really small but very important example. Because I think we do have two traditions within the trade union movement. I think we have a tradition of sexualism versus solidarity, and we can see the potential for that to play itself out. Sexualism, which attempts to assert jobs over the environment, national unity against a wider global campaigning. We have a tradition of national unity versus internationalism, and it's really important that we fight for the tradition of internationalism at this absolutely crucial moment. There can be no just transformation of society which reconfigures the inequalities of the global economy, that reconfigure the inequalities of the development that has taken place on the back of exploitation of the global south. And finally, and therefore that tradition of internationalism and climate justice has to be the heart of what we do. And finally, we have a question about not returning to business as usual, but actually what the alternatives are. And the alternatives are not just a Green New Deal, but it is about asserting the need for democratic control over the economy, this use of the word economy, which is just posed in the abstract without any kind of differentiation about what actually the economy means. Does that mean an economy run and organised in the interest of a minority? Or are we talking about an economy which is based on democratic control and planning, which asserts the interests of working class people globally in harmony with nature and the planet that we live upon? Thanks, Josh.
Brilliant, thanks a lot. We've got some questions. Sorry, I got muted. We've got some questions, so I'll get straight into them and we'll get as many answered as possible. I'll ask three first and then leave it to the speakers to decide. The first question is from Brian, who says, do you think the reduction in emissions due to the lockdown will have an effect on the strategies of climate change movements? And he says, can you frame it in terms of like workplace-based and trade union struggles? The second question is, I believe, from Feline, who says, given the human population has expanded on the basis of intensive agriculture and unsustainable production methods, is it now impossible to meet the needs of humans while being in harmony with nature? And the final question of this round I'll ask is, I wonder what the speakers think about the impulse to want to focus on individual behaviour as a way of controlling what we can do when the sheer scale of the monumental environmental damage can seem overwhelming and quite impossible to take on all at once. If you'd like to decide amongst yourselves who answers them, that'd be great.
Josh, would you mind just repeating that last question really quickly? Apologies.
Yeah, so the final, I've just lost it. So it is, what do you think about the focus on individual behaviour that crops up in the movement quite a lot? And do you think it's sort of a way of just controlling what we can, compared to obviously the overwhelming feeling that there is to take on the whole environmental crisis all at once?
Josh, can I answer the question about agriculture and population?
Yeah. Brilliant. Do you want to go now?
Okay, thanks. There are several aspects to this, I think, that are very important. One is that population is not growing the way people necessarily think it is. There are very few countries on Earth where population is still growing sharply, and most of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. And the way I think it's important that we understand that there is already enough food for everybody on Earth. You know, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization makes it very clear that there is enough food on Earth for everybody to have at least 2,300 calories a day. And what this means is that people like me, my age, people in their 50s and older, don't need that many calories. Teenagers, we know they grow like crazy. They need 3,000 calories a day. So point is, there's enough food for everyone already. And yet we have millions upon millions of people who don't just go to bed hungry every day. We have the best part of 1 billion people who are physically and mentally affected by not getting enough nutritious food. And that is always going to be like that under capitalism, because the problem is not enough food. The problem is access to food, because access to food is driven by profit. And it's not about whether you need the food, it's about whether you can afford to pay for it. So the other thing about capitalism is that it's incredibly wasteful. We know there is, in industrial food production, there are times when at least 20% and sometimes up to 1/3 of the food is wasted between the farm and usually in storage, usually in transport. And again, none of that needs to be wasted. It's actually wasted because it's more profitable than storing it effectively, bizarrely. And the sort of final point I'd want to make on this is that intensive agriculture is not necessarily more productive. Actually, mixed farms that are diverse and, a mixture of animals and arable, and these don't necessarily need to be small backbreaking work or anything, small farms or anything like that. We can be talking about some very large farms, but the point is, if we organize our farming in a sustainable way, it can produce more food than it does now. We can feed more people than we do now, and we can do it on the basis of need, and also we can do it sustainably. It's just, you have to take out the profit motive though first. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Sorry for any technical issues that we're having at the moment. I'd like to invite Martin back now for the questions.
Well, I think they're all really good questions. I'd love to spend hours talking about all of them, actually. But I think the one I wanted to respond to is the question about emissions and lockdown. Because I think one of the things that's happened during the lockdown is everyone has been enthused by the clarity of the air, the blue skies, how the air feels nicer as you're walking around. But actually, I think the reality is that the amounts of carbon emissions are not being affected at all, very, very much at all. The estimate is that 2020 will see a reduction of 5% of global emissions of greenhouse gases on previous years. It's a big jump, but actually it's very little compared to what we are supposed to get if we want to hit the 1.5 temperature rise above pre-industrial averages. I think the estimate is that we need around 7 to 8% a year globally reduction. And that 5% is significant, but it's nowhere near enough. And that's partly because big industry hasn't really stopped. So the air pollution in cities is better because car use particularly has dropped, and that's led to an improvement in air pollution. But actually that's very little to do with the environment. Now, I think it's right for the questioner to say that will probably lead to people thinking about their environment and the cities and how they are and so on. I'm not sure it would necessarily particularly lead to a changing amount of struggles. I mean, I think it gives us as environmentalists and socialists an opportunity to talk about what it is about capitalism that keeps pumping up fuel, even pumping out greenhouse gas emissions, even though we're apparently all locked down. So I'm skeptical that in itself that will make much difference. I think what's more likely, as Michelle and Suzanne have suggested, is that people have a sense that actually it doesn't need to be this way, that actually quite quickly companies can convert themselves from producing cars to producing ventilators, that there's, as Suzanne said, the magic money tree is there. And I think that for a lot of activists will be a thing that does inspire a bit of a sense of actually we don't need to go back to the old ways. And I think the job for the left and the environmental movement is to make that concrete, to say these are the things we are going to demand, and on the other side of the lockdown.
Josh, do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the points that Martin has made there, just about emissions reductions, absolutely right. I'd add to that a couple of things on emissions reductions, which is, I mean, it does, the emissions reductions are potentially small, but equally the time, this is a month and a bit, and as Martin has pointed out, a whole amount of industry hasn't closed down in those circumstances, and even with that limited shutdown, we see emissions reductions falling. So the change is possible. And I think this is a really, really central part of it. Having said that, those in power, the ruling elite, those who have made huge £1 trillion worth of profits out of the fossil fuel industries and carbon intensive industries, they are lobbying with the most the greatest urgency and mobilizing all of their forces to ensure that we go back to business as usual ASAP. And not only are they lobbying to go back to business as usual, so this is the real question, I think, about the emissions reductions. Are they going to get their way, that we go back to that situation? But not only are they lobbying for that, they're lobbying for extra support to go back to business as usual. So if you look at Branson, you know, if you look at British Airways, this opportunistic, classic capitalist using the situation of overproduction or over capacity to claim huge government subsidies to restructure their businesses whilst they get back to running their businesses in the way they want to, despite its devastating impact on our climate and ecological circumstances. For some reason, I'm on a Greenpeace Canada email list, so Michelle will, you know, no doubt, you know, speak much more confidently and eloquently about these things than I do. But, you know, the oil industry there is this massive lobbying to cut back on any regulation so they can get business as usual, but with no regulation to prevent what they're doing and the damage that they are doing. So really, I think the question of emissions reduction has to throw in sharp relief for us the huge class struggle that is there. And that will need to be waged in order for us to come out of this post-COVID situation with anything approaching the transformation that we now know is possible and necessary, but really, really requires these huge social mobilizations because we know what the other side are doing at this moment in time. I think I will leave it there because I know, Michelle, you perhaps were going to take up that issue of individual behavior as well as some of the other things.
Yes, can I jump in on this?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really incredible moment because you think about, you know, this question about individual behavior. Already I felt that in the movement as a whole, this question was really being overtaken by the ability to build the kinds of movements that can impose a bigger change. 500,000 people on the streets of Montreal, September 27th, it raises so much bigger prospects than, you know, just being satisfied with what we can do individually, because it's such a huge endeavor. How can we possibly make change? And in fact, this was supposed to be the year of the climate ultimatum by left forces in Quebec, who said that if by October, the Quebec government did not come up with the plan to meet the Paris targets, to make the changes that are needed to transform Quebec society in order to meet those things, there would be a mounting campaign of struggle. And everyone recognized when the COVID crisis hit that this was going to be taking a back burner. Everyone went behind the government, which was imposing measures around COVID-19. And there was a real reluctance on all political forces of the left, the unions, to criticize the governments. But that's starting to change again. And you can see people getting their footing again. And part of it is because what have we seen? That it was so impossible for so long, that the neoliberal policies we've lived with for decades, that all of a sudden grocery workers' wages have been raised $2 an hour because they're frontline workers. Personal support workers have had their wages raised $4 an hour in Ontario because they won't go to work in these conditions with no PPE, with no, you know. All of a sudden, the question of housing the homeless, it's dealt with. In Toronto, they have housed the homeless. It is done. It's not a permanent fix, but they did it. They did it quickly. And so there's so many fronts like this, and a moratorium on evictions. This can be done. These massive system-wide changes can be done. And it's so urgent that it happen. You think about in terms of food waste and the question of, can we provide the food? I don't know if people have seen in the US, the giant giant operations for chicken farms. For example, 10 million chickens have been culled and buried, 10 million. And there are enormous lines at food banks, enormous lines all over the country. In this country, there's 13% unemployment. That was just announced today. That's where it's at. So there's this crying need for planning based on human need, which is also based on a rational metabolism between humans and nature. That's the project. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of potential to make those arguments convincingly, because everything's thrown up in the air. It's just the forces to do it.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We do have another round of questions, but first I'd just like to make a couple of announcements. So next Tuesday on the 12th of May, Campaign Against Climate Change, the trade union group, are kicking off a film series, a series of screenings and discussions which explore the need for radical transformation around climate change. So it's going to start with a screening of the plan that came from the bottom up. There's going to be a Q&A afterwards with speaker Steve Sprung, who's a film's director, and Daniel Pafford, who's from the Green New Deal UK. And we'll also be doing another live Facebook event next week at Bookmarks Bookshop, the same time, same place. This time it won't be with authors, though. This time we're going to be joined by a couple of poets. So there'll be a live poetry event for about an hour next Friday, so please tune in. And now I'll get on with what's likely to be the last round of questions. So thank you to everyone who's asked questions and joined us tonight. So the first question is from John in Scarborough, who says, despite the horror of the coronavirus, there's an excitement around how quickly major polluting industries can be closed down. Giving us a glimpse of how, with political will, humanity could tackle the climate crisis, do you think that this glimpse will give support to the fight for the change that we're needing at the moment? Another question that has come in, I'm not sure who this one is from, says, Sarah talked about the way capitalism is driven by the market and neoliberalism. During the current crisis, many governments have been forced to abandon all of that with huge state spending and money for social welfare, businesses, and so on. Does this mean that the ruling class will abandon the old policies after the crisis? It'd be good to hear what you think, a few people's thoughts on that. And the final question, or likely to be the final question of the evening, is what are the top priority reforms that we should be fighting for in the immediate short-term future to tackle the worst impacts of climate change? And I'll let you decide amongst yourselves again who'd like to speak first. Perhaps Sarah could start on a question that's addressed to her. That might work.
Certainly. Right, sorry, I'm just going to have a quick look at that question again about, okay, capitalism is driven by the market and neoliberalism. And yes, during the virus, many governments have been forced to abandon that, huge state spending. And, you know, as Michelle described it very well, this is happening in, you know, in my city as well, that homeless people are being housed. Not permanently and not very well, but it has happened and they are being fed. Does this mean the ruling class will abandon the old policies after the crisis? I think no, not unless they are forced to. I think that, I mean, I'm a trade unionist and we responded as quickly as we possibly could to get our workplaces shut down, to get us, all the staff working from home, but also to make sure that our colleagues who are agency workers who don't have the same contracts as us, to make sure that they were on full pay too. Also our cleaning colleagues who are outsourced workers, to make sure that if they, obviously they would be sent home when the offices were closed. So we were saying that they needed to be on full pay as well and not statutory sick pay. And we made huge progress in this. We also, we came up with a long list of demands, including saying that all of our colleagues who are at home with children and with caring responsibilities cannot possibly do the same amount of work that they used to do. They can't do it from home, even though, you know, they've got the laptops and they've got the software and all the rest of it in my organisation, but you simply can't avoid the reality of the virus. And therefore we pushed and we won that people could have carer plans and essentially say, you know, I can only do 4 hours a day or 5 hours a day or 3 hours a day or 2 hours a day even, but would still get full pay because it recognised the reality of the virus and what they were dealing with in their personal circumstances. And I think this is a model for, you know, in embryo for what we need to do, whether it's insisting that we don't go back until our workplaces are safe and that schools should stay closed, because with the best will in the world, small children, particularly in primary school, are, you know, you can't socially distance children. This is nonsense. So these things should stay closed until it's safe. And from there, it's like we don't want to go back to the old forms of pollution, the terrible traffic and air quality in Manchester. It's, you know, there's quite substantial parts of the year in Manchester where you can taste the air. And if we just allow this, then I think we can simply go back to what we had before. But now is the time to push, because we are, you know, there are huge numbers of us. We are organized in workplaces. We are all using Zoom and Skype for meetings. We are all using these technologies. We have this ability to organize even when we can't go out on the streets, you know, and you see the way the clap for carers on Thursday nights at 8 o'clock has become politicized, with people demanding PPE for health workers and social care workers, and for shop workers and food distribution workers as well. But it really does come down to what we do. And I think this is also a time when actually, if you are the person in your workplace who says, we need to have a meeting, we need to do this, we can't put up with whatever the situation is, you will find people who agree with you. And this is a time when even, you know, one voice raised can make a big difference and become a real, you know, you are planting a flag in the sand there. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Sarah. I'd like to invite Martin Empson to come back on the questions.
Well, the question about priorities to fight for, I think, is quite an interesting one. I think it's a very difficult one to answer, partly because I think, as tonight's meeting has outlined, actually what we need is a complete overhaul of almost every aspect of the economy, a complete transformation of how we organise our lives, how we go to work, how we travel, how we live, and so on. I suppose if I was magically made Prime Minister tomorrow, and I think these sort of things would depend very much on where you live, but the priorities, I think, would have to be, one, the renationalisation, the taking into public ownership of the energy infrastructure and the energy companies, and the transport infrastructure, so that actually we can start to allow people to travel very cheaply or for free, and to heat their homes and to light their homes very, very cheaply, and to start to transform how that energy and that transport is organised in towards a zero carbon economy. That's not going to happen, I think, under private ownership. The second thing I think I would do is to take on the fossil fuel companies, to put a complete ban on the expansion of, say, fracking, to block the further extraction of coal in any forms, and to force them to transition to renewable infrastructure, which would, I think, be my third one, the massive investment in that. I mean, the interesting thing about these demands, and I think it goes back to a point that Naomi Klein makes in her most recent book about the Green New Deal, which is that actually, unless the Green New Deal or the 1 million climate jobs that we're fighting for, unless they start to challenge the priorities of capital, unless they start to challenge capitalism itself, actually they won't go anywhere. They'll just end up being part and parcel of the system. And that doesn't just mean taking on the fossil fuel companies. It also means challenging inequality, poverty. It means challenging colonialism and imperialism. It means challenging racism and gender inequality and so on. So actually, kind of, I think, one of the things we did with the 1 million climate jobs was to try and say, look, the solutions to climate change are ones that benefit ordinary working people. They benefit the poorest in society. And that's how we're going to move to a sustainable society. It's not just that we're going to get nice politicians in number 10 who are going to do it for us. It's actually that we're going to create a social movement that is fighting for reforms that make the world better, but also improve ordinary people's lives. So I think it's not just about the nature of the demands, it's about how we implement them and what our vision for them is.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. I'd like to invite Suzanne to speak, if you'd like to come back on any of the questions. And then
Yeah.
Michelle.
Thanks, Josh. Perhaps just pick up on a couple. First of all, John's question about, despite the horror of COVID, does it allow us to have some hope in the possibility of transitioning our society? And I mean, I think, we've kind of all spoken to that, and I agree. I think it does, John, in the way that we've spoken about today. But it is going to be full of contradictions, and it's going to be full of a contestation in a very, very genuine way. When rightly, when those in the environmental movement, they talk about capitalism, and they talk about the problem of this ever expanding growth in capitalism pushing up against the limits our planetary boundaries and the limits of Earth's resources, and rightly, that is a huge contradiction in capitalism of therefore breaking our relationship with nature. There's a further contradiction in capitalism, which is that because capitalism is a system which is accumulation for accumulation's sake in competition, it also lays waste to society's resources, nature's resources, both in growth and in crisis. And as it does it in crisis, the experience of people of instability, of fear, can come to the forefront. So although we've seen a glimpse of transitioning society, we are also seeing a very frightening prospect for millions of people globally in terms of unemployment, in terms of huge economic devastation for them personally and their communities. And in that context, it is very possible for those at the top of society to push that the only way out of this crisis is a return to business as usual, regardless of the regardless of the environmental impacts of that. And that's what we have to be really, really challenging from the outset. One of the things that really stands out for me, I think those of us who have seen, obviously not something on this scale, but the 1980s, the devastation of the 1980s, or the impact of the climate crisis in 2008. One of the things that stands out for me was at that time, there was no alternative. The movement didn't have an alternative. There was criticism, there was critique, and there was resistance of a most fantastic level, but they didn't seem to feel like there was much of an alternative. And I think here we have an alternative to that. There should be absolutely no mass unemployment coming out of this COVID crisis. Why should anybody be without work when we clearly have to transition to a society through work that allows us to tackle environmental crisis? And just one other thing, someone mentioned it before, we've seen who the key workers are. The investment should be in caring, the very greenest of jobs, the very lowest carbon of jobs. That's where the investment should be. There should be no mass unemployment, but these are clearly campaigns that you need to take up. Final point from me is in terms of initiatives. There are lots of initiatives taking place. 350.org calling for a just recovery. In Britain, the UK, the Green New Deal calling for a Build Back Better campaign. XR have got their No Going Back campaign at this moment in time, all of which I think focus around a similar thing. I think our priorities have got to be to get behind those campaigns, but also we do have to campaign within the trade union movement and the working class movement. I mean, I would just say very practically, we are not far away from putting motions back into our union meetings. We are not very far away from the initiatives we're taking at this moment in time. If you're a local activist organising Zoom meetings in the context of any post-COVID discussions, we need the voices of of why we need to be addressing the climate crisis coming out of this, and the real alternatives that we've got if we build unity and we're willing to challenge the forces that are rained against us.
Brilliant. And Michelle, would you like to come in on the questions?
I guess I would just, I agree with everything that has been said, and this discussion has made me think a lot about that concrete question of what comes next. There are discussions happening everywhere about the scale of the crisis, the fear that people have about the reopening of the economy and what that's going to mean. Just for example, the meatpacking plant Cargill meat packing plant south of Calgary, Alberta, Alberta being the main oil sands development area. Out of a plant of 2,000 people, 971 tested positive for COVID-19. And they shut down the plant for, I don't know, a couple of weeks. They're reopening it. And what they've done, they've installed these little screens between people on this assembly line. It's a meat packing plant, but they're now blaming the COVID outbreak on people's living conditions. And they're saying these are migrant workers, and those people live in houses with lots of people. And so they're totally turning it in on they're scapegoating the workers who they're forcing back to work. So this stuff is happening. There are fights happening everywhere. And so I think an immediate question is how do we participate in those struggles? Because we're in our unions, we're in our community organizations, we're environmental activists, but we're also part of other networks. And how do we introduce some of this perspective that we've talked about today? And I think that's an urgent task for everyone. There are concrete reforms right now. I'll begin again with the Indigenous-led struggle. There is a fight right now. The Wet'suwet'en fight is not over. They have managed to stall some of the development. And right now there's a campaign for divestment. An investment company called KKR on Wall Street. They are taking on 65% of the cost of this pipeline. We can push them and we can stop this pipeline. That is a pressure point. Just like the fight around Standing Rock, this is another fight where those movements can make a difference, and we have to be involved in it. There was a town hall yesterday of 1,000 people on this very issue, organized by Greenpeace US. On the question of no bailout for oil corporations, this is actively happening. They are going to try and spend billions and billions of dollars to bail out these companies that are completely well, I don't have to convince anyone here. And the last thing I want to say is there's an example. I didn't get to talk about it, but I mentioned GM Oshawa, the fight for green jobs, and they weren't successful. The plant closed in December. Thousands of workers were laid off. But Green Jobs Oshawa continued to fight for that to be reopened, nationalized, and produce electric vehicles. The COVID crisis hit. They started to demand that PPE be produced there. They won the fight. They've got 50 jobs out of these thousands. It's a beginning. They want to make them permanent, and they want to produce the things on an ongoing basis. So that's, I think that's an important, inspiring example of actually green jobs fight that was able to, in this current context, adapt and to gain a victory. And I think we need to promote it, which I should have done in my talk.
Brilliant. I'd like to thank all the speakers, obviously, for joining us tonight, and obviously everyone who's at home watching as well. I'd just like to give everyone a final reminder. The book is available online. It's well worth it, as you can tell by one word from off the little page notes as well in it. And I'd just like to hand it over to Martin to have a little sum up, say any last words, and obviously hopefully see you all next week. So thanks again for everybody who's joined.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks to our speakers tonight. Thanks to Bookmarks for organising this. I do hope people read the book, System Change, Not Climate Change. I think it has a lot to talk about in the in understanding the climate crisis and the period that we're in. I think Suzanne is absolutely right to say that what we face after lockdown is likely an enormous economic crisis on the scale we've not seen since the 1930s, and perhaps even exceeding that. We already know that unemployment in the United States is on a level that's par with the early 1930s. And we know that the 1930s led to the rise of fascism, the far right, Hitler and Mussolini, but we also know it was a time of mass working class struggle and revolutionary movements. And I think the job of the left and the environmental movement in that period is to try and shape and direct that movement, to have, as Suzanne and others have said, a concrete vision of how things can be better, how people don't have to be unemployed, how people could have decent union jobs with in renewable industries, and I think that's a vision worth fighting for. But also, I think the socialists go further. We say actually we want a world where ordinary working people, the people who create all the wealth, the people who do all the jobs, the people who keep the system running, they're in charge of it, and they make the decisions, not in the interests of a tiny minority, but in the interests of everybody, of every living thing on the planet. and the planet going forward. So we, as the book says, need system change, not climate change now.